You do, yes, and I've instructed them that when Dean Paul comes down, the coffee's no longer $2 a bag, it's $3.50.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. I told them you were a dean and that you earn the same as the deans do around here. Right? The deans around here? Not at the university. No, I'm selling Paul coffee. Right, St. John's College. We take every opportunity we can to extract money out of innocent folk. Have you learned to say anything? Does anybody need or not have a copy of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People?
My copy went off the internet.
Oh, well, you know.
Are those free for deans?
Free for the dean.
Oh, let's read it.
If anybody wants it in French, I have one in French. Did you get one of those? Paul, did you get one of those?
I was waiting for somebody else to do one.
Dale? You need one of those?
Honey.
Well, it's essentially a legal document, so you have to pay attention. So the short answer is I have no idea.
I've only got 4 minutes.
Haven't heard the last name.
Oh, Lorna, did you do what I'm sorry?
Did you know the team? We've got all our stuff.
Think it was me?
Tomorrow, the park across the road, right? I know I got to pay. I can show you the park there, and that was good.
Well, we can pay the partner to pay it.
Which is right across the road. I think the site
All right, so everybody has sufficient sugar, coffee, and so can we begin? And we'll begin as we always do by acknowledging that we are on Treaty 1 land, the homeland of the Cree, Anishinaabe, and Dakota people in this part of the world in any case, and also the homeland of the 18 nations. And we are very grateful for the privilege of being able to live and have our being on these lands. We have sugar for you to keep you going. Yeah.
It's not wine, but you know.
Yeah. Heather seemed to think that I should buy you all a glass of wine.
I second that motion.
Bunch of Anglicans. My gosh, what can we expect? A couple of things. You don't have to put up with me tonight. You have to put up with Vince. So yeah.
Welcome back.
They're very enthusiastic that you're back. It shows you. The other thing I wanted to tell you is that Bishop Mark MacDonald has agreed to come next week for our last class. And so Bishop Mark is going to talk to us about some of the contemporary developments in the Anglican Church around Indigenous peoples in Bishop Mark's own way. So get the word out to all of those folks who are skipping, because they may actually want to show up next week, and he's quite excited about coming. So And that will be our last class next week.
Wow.
Wow. So then we'll have to have a cake and,
I have a question
Why?
about our written assignments.
yes ma'am.
Are they due next week, in which case we don't have a reflection on next week's class?
I didn't think of that.
Oh, this is
Thought they were doing the
after.
13th.
Did I say the week after? I usually do that with my students, just for the simple reason that otherwise they all laugh their detention.
Okay. Okay.
I did say November the 13th, so you have a week.
Okay.
So yes, you have to do a reflection on what Bishop Mark has to say. Cool? Okay. Thank you. Yeah, we did. So, all right. Okay.
So today we're going to be talking about sovereignty, the law, and something else. Justice. Justice, thank you. Let me write that down. Okay. I probably will be spending quite a bit of the time talking about the sovereignty issue. In 1990, I can remember sitting on the couch at my apartment at the time and watching the news, and these nasty Mohawks on the television, protesting as well as building up a barricade. And I mean, I'll tell you what I thought at that time, but I just wanted to perhaps jog your memory as to where you were and what you thought when you heard about the Oka crisis in 1990. Anyone want to? Volunteer? I don't think, were you here?
No,
No,
I don't even know what the end of crisis.
You were in England.
You were in England. Donna,
The wall had
remember
just
where
come
she
down
was.
in Berlin.
You were in England. Yes, Dawn.
Yeah, I'm at that scary stage in life where I can remember 1990 better than I can remember yesterday. I was newly ordained, and so I remember that crisis for a variety of reasons, and partly because I had to preach within the context of that unfolding events, and remembering feeling so so ill-equipped to know how to preach.
I was just thinking that at that time I had 2 young children at home, and seeing those images on on the news, and just being very sad and frightened for what the future would hold for my children in terms of relationships and the love, the love that we're called to share, but yet they're seeing, these images, and how I struggled as, a young mom at the time, trying to explain this to, to my 10-year-old, and they were asking me, what's happening, right? And so, well, so that was, I remember that being a huge challenge, to the image of what, at their young minds, what Canada was supposed to be about, and then, but yet seeing this happening.
Was anyone there, actually? You were there. What do you think? Oh, Paul, you were there. Were you, Paul? Were you there?
I was there.
Okay.
I was at Christchurch Cathedral as a theological student running the drop-in center for the street folks. And Louis Marie was one of our priests. And he went over and he stayed there with the Mohawks for a couple of weeks. So we were very worried about everybody.
Yeah. Some of you were probably almost born. Andrew. How old were you, 2?
No, I have vague memories of hearing about Oka on the news, but I was in a 3rd grade classroom when it was happening.
Oh, all right, yes. Okay. Anyone else?
I I don't remember a lot. I was in high school, and I remember having an argument with a friend who just thought that, you know, these Indians should just go to their own reserve. And I remember...
They were on their own.
Well, that's what I said. And I said, you know, his mother had recently died, and I had said, you know, this is a burial ground. Yeah, how would you feel if somebody showed up at the Brome Cemetery and tried to put a golf course over the burial ground where your mother is? Like, this is as simple as I could put it for you, and it was still, yeah.
I was 3 years in Canada at that time, and 3 years ordained. I was serving in a Lutheran parish in Regina, where I was beginning to learn about the realities of Indigenous life in Canada. I was already dean of the conference, which was a little different than our setup, more like the area dean, and was learning from the Lutheran ministry at that time in Regina called Circle of Life. So when this all, you know, blew up on the TV, the computer screen, it was yeah, it was quite a wake-up. I mean, as it was, I guess, for many people, like, there's something really wrong here.
Mm. Yeah. The reason why
Can you explain what it was?
yeah, Oka was during the time when the Mohawk Nation were...
Where in the country?
It was in...
Just outside of Montreal.
Thank you.
It's about a third of the way between Montreal and Ottawa.
Yeah.
It's where they make all the good cheese.
Okay.
That'll help you, cheese.
Do they make wine?
No, cheese.
Just
It's Trappist.
yeah, and they were protesting because the government, not the government, but the municipality or the town of Oka were encroaching into their land. And once again, trying to take over and use their land without their permission, basically, right? And it was a major deal. The army was there. The army was called in. There was standoffs, and like the warriors and the soldiers were all face to face, kind of thing, and yeah, it was quite something. Yeah. When I was watching it, I thought to myself, you know, when I said crazy Mohawks, I meant that in a very nice way. Is that possible?
So you didn't know, you didn't.
No, but at the time I thought, at the time I thought that they were nuts, because here I am, a treaty Indian, right, a treaty person, whose ancestors had signed treaties with the crown, and here were Native people, basically insurgents, really, and fighting and standing up against the government of Canada, which is something that I have been taught to really be careful not to do, right? And so I'm sitting there going, oh my God, you know, this is not right. Something's going to happen. But it wasn't until afterwards when I really realized that what they were doing really was that they were protecting their territory and their land from an alien nation, basically is what they thought. But this also was a time when the word sovereignty was starting to be used more and more all over the place, all across Canada. Before this, it was self-government was what that word was, and what Indigenous people were talking about. And then all of a sudden, sovereignty became the word. And it wasn't just with Indigenous people as well. It was as well a continuation of long history. The Quebec government and the people of Quebec were also talking about sovereignty, right? So this had really, really major connotations. And I don't think that before the Oka crisis happened, I don't think the rest of the country really even cared about Indigenous sovereignty or about Indigenous nationhood, or even that we did have aspirations for Indigenous for our own sovereignty and our own nationhood and our own governance. And so that word became quite entrenched within the language of Canada and the political language on the streets as well. And it caught on in a lot of ways, and so Native people started to use that word more and more after that. And even though it came with a whole lot of baggage, and a whole lot of different kinds of baggage as well. So it wasn't just Native people that were trying to grapple with what does this mean. The federal government at the time was also trying to understand, okay, well, what is it? What does sovereignty mean? And what is it that Indigenous people think it means? And then people, of course, during this time were also talking about that. Well, what do these Indians want now, right? And I remember hearing that because I was in theology here at the time, and that was one of the questions and that I heard all over the place, and the discussions that were going on around the university at the time were quite interesting. And but I really enjoyed what this guy, I read his last name is Laforme. I don't know what his first name is. You know?
It's not Justice before.
Well, they could be it. Anyway, he says.
He was the first commissioner of the TRC. Wasn't that?
What he said was that sovereignty, he said, is the right to self-government which Aboriginal people neither surrendered nor lost by way of conquest. Those were his exact words, and I'm going, wow, that for me, that makes a lot of sense. And so as that word began to be used, we started to look into kind of like the past. And I think we've talked about it here. We've talked about the what do you call it? The Royal Proclamation. And we've talked about Oka Abid, we've talked about the treaties, and we've talked about the Indian Act. And so all of those things were being looked at within this word called sovereignty at that time. And how that was being used within the context of the Indigenous peoples and within their Indigenous governments. So what does sovereignty then for Indigenous people mean in terms of the band council system? Like what kinds of things are Indigenous people responsible for? Are we a municipal government? Are we a nation unto ourselves? So, you know, a mini nation inside the nation of Canada? Or are we other things besides those things? And the answer seems to have been, well, yes, and perhaps not, or somewhat could be the answer I think a lot of people would have given. And I guess the one thing that really started happening as well was that Indigenous people started to look at that and how the settlement of this country and the Aboriginal settler relations was very much tied into that word as well. And so this was a country that we inhabited already before contact, that our people were intelligent, self-sufficient, that they were self-governing nations. And these were all defined within a certain territory. So sometimes you can see these maps that have like a green thing, and then, you know, this is where the Cree territory was, right? And so on and so forth. And there were already agreements and treaties and how you could approach those territories even before settlement happened. And so they started working on these agreements, as we had talked about, called treaties. And it's really interesting what the Supreme Court says a lot about these things, and about self-government as rule and self-rule. The Supreme Court sees a treaty as being unique, and it is an agreement which is neither created nor terminated according to the rules of international law. So a treaty is something that is quite different from outside the boundaries of Canada. And so because it was thought that Native people were never conquered, nor did they ever give up their right to self-rule and self-government, that this was something that was totally unique to Canada. And then again in 1990, the Supreme Court ruled again, said a treaty is the intention to create obligations, the presence of mutually binding obligations, and a certain amount of solemnity. So it carried with it these binding agreements, part of which Indigenous people have always interpreted it as that we've never given up any of our sovereignty. And so it seems to be that even the Supreme Court of Canada was agreeing with that, with limitations, I would believe. And even academics would agree, right? That was probably the case. And
well,
that,
we may have questions of what a notion of limited sovereignty can mean.
that's right.
I'm having problems with that, but you just keep going.
But these were agreements really of cooperation and co-occupation of the land. And they were not anything that was incumbent on Native people to have to to give up. So the Mohawk Nation at the time they were talking a lot more about being a separate Indigenous and sovereign nation, and even the laws of Canada did not apply to their territory, and even the Supreme Court, I think, at the time, the Constitution, as we were talking about in the 1982 Constitution and repatriation of that, Indigenous people were, at the time, going to England to go and petition the Queen to make sure that the inherent right of Indigenous people and the treaty rights were entrenched within the Constitution as well. And so they were even thinking at that time that this was a nation-to-nation agreement, and that this was a nation-to-nation thing that they needed to talk through, and that they did not want to be forgotten, and they didn't want to be excluded either. And so the Supreme Court of Canada, in terms of the Constitution, said as well that existing Aboriginal rights must be interpreted flexibly so that as to permit the evolution over time. And that was from Regina versus Sparrow in 1982. And so this kind of, for some, they interpret this as meaning that the Indigenous people had the right to self-government. And that really you didn't need to put this into the Constitution anyway, right? Because it's already there. And that we already do have the right to self-government. And of course the Royal Proclamation kind of has some of that within it as well. That before the Crown can make treaties, then they needed to speak to the Indigenous peoples who live on that land and on that property. Did you want to say something more?
No, well, I just was checking your Sparrow reference there to see that you got it right, and you did.
Did I?
Yeah. I have it right here. I think there are 2 points that need to be picked up on in terms of these notions of both sovereignty and rights. First of all, the Constitution says that existing Aboriginal and treaty rights are hereby recognized and affirmed. So that's treaty and Aboriginal rights that existed in 1982. The problem is nobody knows what they were. Okay, and the existing, that little word existing in there, it's one of those weasel words in the law. It's like, in my job description, a warden shall normally be a cleric. Normally, okay?
At least it wasn't a normal cleric.
No, we've never had a normal cleric.
It's a myth.
We haven't met all the past wardens. That little weasel word existing is an extremely important word because it doesn't just say Aboriginal and treaty rights are hereby affirmed, okay? Because it assumes, there's an assumption that some might have disappeared, some might stay on, and is what those are. And what the courts have said is that, in fact, sovereignty is one of those existing rights that has never been abrogated. And it's one of those interesting things in all of the treaties and in all of the court cases. They virtually never ever talk about government, and sovereignty. Okay, the Indian Act abrogates sovereignty by imposing a certain form of governance onto the First Nations. Okay, so the Indian Act does it unilaterally without any consultation. But that doesn't destroy sovereignty. That only basically undermines it. So it's one of those things where it remains despite the fact that everything else has been
Chris, don't the treaties abrogate some of the sovereignty?
No, they don't say anything about it.
But when you cede the land, aren't you ceding the sovereignty of the land?
You probably are, except for the fact that what you haven't ceded is the ability to govern yourselves in the land that you still have.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that part of that is that you didn't cede, like you ceded the land, but only from as far deep as from the top and as far deep as the plow can go. Right? Anything below that was never part of, at least I think, unless that they
Plows being very useful in Nelson House.
No.
A lot of plows in Nelson House. It's something they use quite frequently. Yeah, huge ones.
So the land underneath really wasn't ceded either, right? And so that goes in along with the whole sovereignty kind of thing, which I think the federal government has tried to usurp in a lot of ways. And but the fact is that Native people never said we give up the right to govern ourselves within any of the treaties, and so that's part of that.
In fact, you could interpret it, and I think it's a strong interpretation, that the fact that the treaties, and Vince talked about this, and I think Joe Keeper talked about it, that they had to choose chiefs in order to sign the treaties, in order for people to negotiate and sign the treaties. But by finding somebody to sign the treaties with, you are recognizing an autonomous sovereign body who has the ability to sign a treaty with you, right? So in fact, the treaties uphold and recognize that there's got to be some kind of governing body there with whom we sign the treaty. And therefore, in some ways, in a kind of peculiar way, the treaties actually uphold sovereignty rather than undermining it. But they've never been read that way. Well, they haven't now, but yeah.
So self-government, I don't think we can actually say what it looks like, really. What is it going to look like? It's very much like our self-determination of the indigenous people within the Anglican Church, right? At this moment, we can't really say, well, what is it going to look like across the board? And I mean, we have a federal government and we have provincial governments, and so we know how we are governed, right? But within the indigenous societies, that's still being worked out and reworked, and people going back to tradition, going back to history, and looking at those things. Okay, what made us specifically Cree within our own governance, within our own territories? And how did we do this, not only within our own band system, but also in relation to the other bands around us? How did that work? And so I think that that's something that's evolving and changing. And I think that it should be that way, at least for a while, until things really can be cemented a little bit more. But I think one of the things that self-government really does, or sovereignty for indigenous people, is that it really is essential for the survival of indigenous peoples, or I would say more so for First Nations people. And in a lot of ways, indigenous people need to treat their land in a very different way than the way that Canada treats the country, the land. And I think a lot of indigenous people are wanting to go back to the way that our ancestors used to run their country, the way that they looked at the ecology around, and the way that they used to work the land. And but not only that, we talked about the sharing of the natural resources as well. Is probably one of the most important ways in which indigenous people can survive. Economically, it makes sense that the people who signed the original treaties did not sign away the rest of the earth below, right? And all of the resources that are in there were never signed away. But the federal government would say, well, yes, you did, right? But according to some of the wordings of the treaties, that never really happened. And it really is also a way of providing sovereignty, one's control over one's culture. Right? We hear a lot about this in Quebec as well, although I think Quebec is a bit strange in that way. I think there is a way you can protect your culture without having to impose on anybody else, but that's just my thought. But it's a way of protecting that culture as well, right? So that all of these years and all of the things that have been done to indigenous people, and we talk about cultural genocide and everything else, and the residential school experience, you know, and the loss of language, and to get back that original teachings, the original, the way that we used to speak, and because of that, return of that, the thought patterns, our way of looking at the world will be very different as well, and which will help to protect a lot of our own ways of thinking and our own cultural beliefs, without having it being imposed upon indigenous people once more, or again, as it always has been.
Well, I was going to say, I think one of the things that Vince just led us into, and one of the difficulties, is that the federal government, insofar, now there's 2 points of it, insofar as the federal government recognizes any kind of notion of sovereignty or self-government, which is fairly limited. One of their big problems is that they want to come up with a cookie-cutter approach, to put it that way. Everybody, all First Nations across Canada will have, I don't know, something in terms of sovereignty. But one of the things is that, we joke about the Mohawks, for example. We wouldn't if there was any Mohawks present, but
Jeff's not here.
The Mohawks, for example, had a very clearly delineated constitutional system of government. The Gainarakawa lays out very carefully the number of the clans, the heads of the clans, how those clans are, the heads of those clans are to meet, how those meetings are supposed to take place, how to replace the heads of those clans, all of this kind of stuff. It's a very clearly delineated system of governance that, in fact, is so clearly delineated that the Americans recognize it and use it for their own constitution. You talk with about the folks on the West Coast. Very different system based around chiefs who are hereditary heads of houses, who are vested with the house, vested with the property, vested with, well, all kinds of symbolic stuff too, songs and dances and stories and symbols, as well as specific fishing spots, specific hunting areas, and they act on behalf of the house, and they act in relationship to the other houses through a complex system of exchanges, which are badly called potlatches in English. So another very complex system of governance that is recognizable to us Westerners as a system of governance. It gets more complicated when you start talking about people like the Cree or like Inuit, who have a much more diffuse system of government. There's a much higher sense of the local autonomy and responsibility of each of the local people, and that they are responsible for looking after themselves, but they are also responsible for looking after the folks next to them. And we know that historically, both groups like the Cree and groups like Inuit, they would get, well, the Cree would gather in the summer, the Inuit would gather in the winter, and they would then spend a whole bunch of time sort of talking. If you've ever been to a Cree meeting or an Inuit meeting, there's a lot of talking. It can go on for days and days. And then out of that comes a whole series of decisions of sort of who's going where to hunt with who for the next season. And also a whole bunch of subsidiary decisions over whose daughter is going to marry whose son and where they're going to go for the next season. So it's much harder for us to put our fingers on that and say, oh, we see a system of governance there. And that's part of the problem, is one, it's how, as Westerners looking at how the Cree do these things, it's so diffuse, it's so consensual and negotiated that it's hard to see it as a system of governance. It is, but it's hard to see it that way. And similarly with Inuit, you talk on issues for days until everybody comes around to agree with it. Okay, and that's the problem. You have some real extremes in Canada in terms of the kinds of governance systems that are in place, and there's a failure, I think, on the part. Now, this is me being an anthropologist. I'll confess. But there's a failure on the part of governments to recognize those profound differences and what a difference they make. And they're very deep. I still remember I had a master's thesis from a student a number of years ago, that she was doing her work on West Coast art, and was talking to one of the artists about tradition and traditional governance. And the artist said, "Are you kidding? No way I want to go back to that. I have a bunch of chiefs telling me what to do, those older chiefs bossing me around and telling me what I do. I don't want anything to do with that stuff." That's West Coast, right? That's an appreciation of what's going out there. It's a fairly authoritarian, hierarchical, it's a very hierarchical system. Try that in a Cree community, and what happens is everybody just gets up and walks away on it. All right, voting with your feet. So there's a lack of the appreciation of those subtle kinds of differences, and how they can still constitute systems of governance, even so. All right, and I think again that's one of the struggles for the First Nations and the Anglican Church. Is you've got people from all of those different groups, all right, who have these very different models. So how do we work those together, even within the context of our church, to make a system that works? So when you're talking about governance, it becomes extremely difficult to know how to approach these things. Now I've worked more in Inuit communities, and Inuit communities I mean, used to drive me mad to try and get a decision. All right, and you sit and you talk for a whole night over, I don't know if you remember this, Brian, you talk for a whole night over an issue, and everybody would get up and leave, and I'd be going, like, what was decided? What? And they don't, and apparently a decision had been made, but I usually missed the point. All right, because it usually has involved me doing something, which I also found out about 2 days later, when somebody said, well, haven't you done it yet? No, I didn't know I was supposed to. I mean, it's so indirect, it's so, by the way, I don't know about Cree, but in Inuktitut, it's very rude and impolite to actually tell anybody directly to do something. You'd never do that, okay? So for example, one of my sisters wanted me to buy diapers for her baby one day, and she came in and she said to me, one has heard that there might actually be some people in town whose fathers could possibly be in need of diapers. You know, it's easy to say that in Inuktitut, it's hard to say it in English. Her baby was my father by the system. So I heard this and I thought, oh, she wants me to go down and buy diapers, which I did. But you never ever ask directly to be, well, it's because you have to say yes. So you never want to put somebody in a position where they'd have to say no. Right. I don't know if that's true in Cree.
Yeah, it's a bit different. Native women actually used to be, and hopefully it's still, there is some continuation of that. Native women were the ones who were in charge. They were the ones that owned the houses. So for Native men, you know, if you messed up or if you did something bad, out you went. Right? And so, because
that's what my Mohawk friend said.
same.
Her husband had done what he had to do, so she sent him home to his mother.
Yeah.
She had the 2 kids. What else did you need them for?
And so it was the women who basically they were the one that told people what to do, how to do it, where to do it. And it was the Native men who usually would be the ones that were quiet, and if they needed to teach somebody something, they wouldn't tell them. They would do it, and then the person was supposed to learn from that. To do it this way is the right way to do it, right? And so that was the role of the men, and the women wouldn't interfere in any of that. And whereas, and also the men would try not to interfere within the women's role as well. And so there is a bit of that, and but not, you know, because I mean the women were the rulers really. They were the ones that were in power.
Donna.
Just a question for you, Chris. In the culture in which you've just identified the non-direct communication method,
Put it politely.
in that diaper scenario, what would Rome look like in that scenario?
Or you just wouldn't do it.
And what would be the consequences?
Well, you'd be considered to be a pretty bad brother, and yeah, you'd be bad-mouthed.
Okay.
Not directly, but behind the back. Well, actually, what would have happened is they would have told my mother. I'm adopted, right? So they would have told my mother, And she would have thought about how horrible this was, and then I probably would have got a lecture from her, but again, it's very indirect. One has heard that there are some people around here who don't support their families. But I have learned, mind you, I will say to you, okay, I'm supposed to know how to behave in an Inuit context, right? I'm supposed to know. I occasionally still screw up. But now that it's a little bit different, because the older men in particular will take me aside and say, you know better, don't do it. Okay? Not in the old days, they wouldn't do that. And certainly the women would never. Well, no, that's not fair. The older women would say that, yes.
It's changed.
Right?
It's changed.
Well, yes.
There's still that indirectness.
Oh, is it? Yes.
But there's a lot more directness to, more younger generation.
Yeah, the younger generation you get more of it, but certainly in the older generation.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are consequences. And you see, because we're talking about a system of exchange of relationships here. So the sister I was referring to, whose diapers I don't know if I heard diapers, diapers for a baby, her husband, my brother-in-law, he was very helpful in fixing my skidoo. And I relied on him very heavily to fix my skidoo. So, if I wanted my brother-in-law to fix my skidoo, I'd buy diapers. Right? And he would come over and make sure my skidoo was running, because I had no clue. But, so, it was a system of, but it is, in Inuktitut, it is extremely indirect in terms of the way you ask for anything. And you can't tell anybody to do anything, okay? Just to give you another example, this has changed as well, but in the old days, a man could not talk directly to his opposite sex in-laws. So he couldn't talk to his mother-in-law, he couldn't talk to his sister-in-law. Similarly, a woman couldn't talk to her father-in-law, etc. And I've actually seen, you know, a house where, you know, the son-in-law is lying on the couch watching TV, and the mother-in-law is there. She can't look at him directly, and the skidoo needs to be fixed. Actually, needs gas. Okay. She can't ask him directly to get gas in the skidoo. So she, looking out the window, idly says, "Oh, one would think that perhaps the skidoo might need some gas." Now, he can't have heard her because she can't speak to him, right? So he lies there for another 15 minutes watching TV. And once it's very clear that he never heard a word she said, he goes out and gets right? Because you can't have any direct communication. But there are ways of getting around it. Right? Normally, by the way, she would tell her husband, and her husband would tell the son-in-law. He wasn't present, so it had to go the other way around.
So how about between parents and children, would it be more direct?
Again, it's inappropriate to direct the minds of your children because you might unsettle their minds. There's another factor that comes in with Inuit, since I got to talking about Inuit, or at least I got to talking about Inuit. The children, Inuit have an understanding of reincarnation. The children are the ancestors reborn. So when I said the little baby was my father, the person who was my father had died and was reborn in this baby. So this baby is my father, and I call him a tata. And had to give all kinds of gifts. Right? So would you direct and tell your father what to do? Or your grandfather, even better? Would you directly instruct them on what they're to do? Would you treat them like that? That's probably inappropriate behavior. You never direct the mind of a child because it might, badly form their mind. So, you let them find out, let them find out the hard way.
Well,
I tried.
That's why in Baker, we had one of the early missionaries there. He was there for about 32 years. Parents would bring their children to him to discipline, because they would not discipline their kids themselves for that same reason.
It's really hard, by the way, when you're a white person in that context, and nobody's telling nobody to do nothing. And sometimes, especially if you don't know how to, run a skidoo in the winter, you really like somebody to just say to you, listen, you idiot, this is how you make it work. But nobody would ever do that. I'm an adult. All right, I'm supposed to know how to behave myself. Sorry, Paul.
So was this in direct form of communication a survival tactic? What's going on?
Oh, I'd never say it was a survival tactic.
What is it?
It's courtesy, politeness. It's how you live with people in very close intimate situations, year after year, month after month, when you're sharing a bed with them and a house with them and a camp with them for the next 45 years, and also because your parents and your grandparents did it, and your kids and your grandkids are going to.
It probably is a way of governing yourself as well,
It is.
right?
It's governance of self,
Yeah.
people around you.
There's this guy named Will Kimicka. I'm not quite sure where I found where this came from, but I only have one page. And it says, in 1981, someone I guess may have asked him what self-government meant, and this is what he said. It will probably be non-racial and allow for the assimilation of people of other races through marriage and socialization. It will probably be non-coercive, allowing people to leave their community if they desire. It will probably respect freedom of conscience, allow each person the right to express those aspects of their heritage that they see worthy of allegiance, and to question those aspects that they do not. And it will undoubtedly be minimally restrictive to the rights of non-members, limiting voting or mobility rights only where necessary to preserve the community from engulfment. So I thought that was a really good quote to think about what it could be or will be, right? As opposed to what is really now within Indigenous communities.
I think, I could say, we are 10-2.
Yes.
Is that why it bombed?
That's right.
Or is that your wife calling? 10 minutes break, coffee, chocolate.